Welcome in today's webinar, PREFER webinar on patient preferences in multiple myeloma, where we will present to you the key results of a patient preference study in multiple myeloma, as well as the concrete applications of it in medicinal product decision-making. This webinar will be a full webinar with several presentations, and there will be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the webinar. However, you can already submit your questions in the chat tool or raise your hand so that you can raise them as well afterwards in a dedicated slot for that. You can also send your questions afterwards to myself, to Rosanne Janssens, or to the PREFER Consortium. And indeed, be aware that this webinar will also be recorded and made public afterwards. This is a presentation which is embedded in the PREFER project. However, this presentation contains only content that reflects the views of the presenters and not the views of PREFER IMI in general. Who are the presenters of today? So first, myself, I am Isabelle Huys. I am Professor of Regulatory Sciences at the University of Leuven, and I am the academic co-lead of the PREFER project. We will also hear a presentation from Dr. Rosanne Janssens, who performed her PhD in the context of PREFER and actually led the multiple myeloma case study and is at the moment postdoctoral research also at the University of Leuven. We have also Professor Irina Cleemput, who is Scientific Program Director at our Belgian Healthcare Knowledge Center and Senior Health Economist. Irina is Chair of the HTA and Payer Stakeholder Advisory Group of PREFER, and she is also co-leading the work package in PREFER on developing the recommendations that come out for patient preference studies. We have also the pleasure here to have Jayne Galinsky, who is actually the former head of research at Multiple Myeloma Patients Europe, where she coordinates the patients' involvement in multiple myeloma patient preference study. She has experience in working on patient preference studies with a focus on multiple myeloma. I will introduce you into the PREFER project itself and also about what are patient preference studies. So PREFER is a collaboration between profit and non-profit entities, as you see here at the right side, where we collaborate to establish recommendations to support development of guidelines for industry, regulatory sciences, regulatory authorities, health technology assessment bodies and payers on patient preference studies and their applications, and more specifically how and when to assess patient preference studies and include them in medical decision makers. We also make trainings, webinars, organizational guidelines, and are in the middle of a process, and actually near to the end as well, of an EMA-UNETA qualification procedure for the patient preference study framework developed at PREFER. IMI PREFER started in 2016, whereby we developed and identified several methods to conduct patient preference studies and also applied them in different case studies, as this is conducted in the multiple myeloma case study. And we are at the moment at the end where recommendations are prepared and will be launched soon. But what are patient preferences actually? Here you see in front of you a definition which has been designed by the FDA, and where you see that it is about qualitative and quantitative assessments of the relative desirability and acceptability to patients of particular characteristics related to treatment and diseases. And that is it indeed. It is about attributes which are linked to benefits, to risks, to inconveniences, to particular uncertainties that are linked to treatments, and where we want to know what people find important and why, and what the trade-offs are that patients make for these particular effects. Patient preferences give us also a lot of other information that is useful in decision making. And how can we generate these informations, these patient preferences? That is by conducting dedicated patient preference studies, which have a design phase, a conduct phase, and also a very important phase on communication. And that all via particular methodologies. We can have qualitative and quantitative methodologies, including interviews for the qualitative ones, where we want to understand what do patients find important, treatment attributes, and why with respect to their therapies. And in the surveys, so in the quantitative studies, we want to get more insight on how much do patients value particular treatments, characteristics, attributes, what are the trade-offs, and how do the preferences differ across patients depending on their patient characteristics. And this has been further developed and worked out for a concrete example, namely the multiple myeloma. And that's why I'm very happy to give now the word to Dr. Rosanne Janssens.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well and see my screen here. So thanks a lot, Isabelle, for the nice introduction and the introduction as well on patient preference studies. I will here explain a concrete implementation of a patient preference study design, conduct, organization, and methodological aspects, methodological learnings we obtained through a study in the context of multiple myeloma, so among multiple myeloma patients. As you see here on the slide, we conducted and designed actually this study in collaboration with several stakeholders, including clinicians across Europe and patients' organizations, which you will hear more about in the presentation also by Jayne. So in general, why did we decide to conduct a patient preference study in the context of multiple myeloma? So taking a more helicopter view or even more on a large scale, we found it important to reveal what matters most to patients. This can be set across therapeutic areas because we want to understand what are the views of patients as end users of treatments towards their disease and treatments that they take. And this is because patients have unique experience both with respect to their disease. They have the symptoms that we do not know as non-patients. They experience the treatment side effects. And so only them can talk about this from an experience-based knowledge. And then particularly in the context of multiple myeloma, we found it a very important case study in view of several developments that are ongoing in multiple myeloma. So multiple myeloma is a treatment context where a lot of clinical trials are ongoing, a lot of new therapies, also therapies with uncertainties related to clinical development, where we find it therefore important to reveal what now matters most to patients. So here you see specifically some important reasons why we wanted to focus on the multiple myeloma treatment setting, is where we want to understand what is a patient's acceptability for uncertainties regarding treatments. And this is especially relevant here, as I mentioned, due to very novel treatments that are upcoming, where there may be benefits and risks and uncertainties that are still to be further investigated on a long term, and where we wanted to understand how do patients view this and what are their trade-offs that they are willing to make between uncertainties, benefits, and risks. Such treatments are also often associated with complex benefit risk trade-offs in view of the fact that there are perhaps high benefits related to novel treatments, but as well uncertain or very severe side effects. So a high benefit, high risk situation. In general, there is a lack of insight into the treatment outcomes that matter most to patients, so a lack of patient-based information and evidence coming from application of robust methodologies to find out bottom up what is now important to patients. And as I mentioned, this existence of several treatments and new developments also leads to clinical equipoise, or where there are many different treatments that make it also difficult in the context of clinical decision making between patients and physicians to now decide what is most important to a particular patient with respect to the treatments and their effects. And as touched upon also by Isabelle, another important aspect of patient preference studies, it allows you to understand how preferences may differ across patients that vary with respect to variables regarding clinical or treatment experience. And this is also certainly the case in the context of multiple myeloma. So which are the methodologies that we applied to elicit patient preferences? Here we started with a qualitative phase where we organized group discussions with patients diagnosed with multiple myeloma. And then we further used this information from the qualitative phase to organize a quantitative or a survey phase, which was an online survey disseminated across patients in Europe. Now, why did we decide to combine both a qualitative and a quantitative survey? It's because we felt, first of all, a qualitative step in the beginning was needed to understand what are now the attributes or the elements related, characteristics related to treatment and disease in multiple myeloma that are most important to patients. And hence these we took further to the quantitative phase where we quantified the importance of these attributes according to patients. So by combining a qualitative and a quantitative component, we obtained complementary evidence. So for the qualitative phase, we tried to understand in an in-depth way why patients would or not take a treatment, what are key elements that would drive their preferences and hence should be included as attributes in a survey phase, both with respect to positive elements. So what do they expect or hope for a treatment that it does for them, as well as negative treatment outcomes or side effects that they experience or would not like to experience. So by having them sit together in the format of a focus group, there was also interactivity by which patients being earlier diagnosed versus patients already later diagnosed, patients with more limited experience with treatments together with patients with more experience could really talk about what they already experienced, and this would generate interactivity with that respect. And then also in the quantitative phase, as I mentioned, we wanted to understand what is now the quantitative value of these different attributes, how do preferences differ, and this was something that we particularly sought to reveal in the quantitative phase, because there we could include a heterogeneous patient population by disseminating the survey to a large patient population across Europe. Here I will provide you with more detail regarding the methods that we used in the qualitative phase. So the discussions were actually group discussions together with patients, where we included about 5 to 7 patients in 4 different group discussions. And as a preparation for these group discussions, we asked patients to complete a form. And here you see an excerpt of this form where we wanted them to already think about what are now outcomes of a treatment you would value most. What do you expect from a treatment that it does for you? But also what are negative or side effects that you either currently experience or would not like to experience? What would make you want to stop taking a treatment? So here they had the chance to already think about this prior to the focus group discussion. And also as a part of the preparation for the group discussion, we asked them to reflect on different treatment outcomes, side effects that we revealed via a prior scoping literature review, where we included different multiple myeloma symptoms, side effects that we identified via reviewing the clinical trials that are ongoing for multiple myeloma. So we did a review of the European clinical trial database in the context of multiple myeloma treatments to see what are, first of all, the endpoints being used right now, so that we could include them already here in the ranking sheet, as well as side effects that were already reported in ongoing clinical trials. And this to make sure that patients could also reflect on elements or side effects that are associated with upcoming treatments. And these patients then were asked during the focus group discussion to elaborate and think about these different characteristics, let's say, to discuss on them and express their opinions. And we revealed actually a very broad range of elements that they discussed. So first of all, on the positive side, is where they discussed treatment outcomes that they would want or that they expect from a treatment to do for them. Is first of all to increase the life expectancy, and then also they expect that the treatment, that this is reflected in their lab results, let's say, so where they can see, okay, the treatment is doing something for me as well, but with the end goal of increasing their life expectancy. You see also here on the slides a very wide range of symptoms and side effects that these patients experienced. We'll point out on a few. So these patients discussed a lot about their quality of life on a daily basis. What do they experience, both with respect to the symptoms and the side effects? So mobility problems is very known in the context of myeloma. So where they experienced a lot of pain, also back pain, bone pain, which hampers them from performing their daily activities. Fatigue or extreme tiredness was another thing that really hampers them from being active and performing the activities that they would want to. And maybe especially here also in the context of COVID-19 is where they discussed about their increased susceptibility to infections. Also, again, limiting their ability to come outside. Also having a psychological burden is where they are really afraid to come outside because they are even more susceptible to infection as another person. But as well, concentration problems and other psychological elements were discussed as neurotoxicities, for example. So really a wide range. It allowed us to grasp what is now the range of things that these patients experience. These elements we took for, and very important, also they discussed several uncertainties with respect to both the positive treatment outcomes, that they were uncertain about how long a treatment would continue to work. Is why they also valued their lab already paid a lot of attention to their laboratory results. They wanted to know or track, to have knowledge on how well the treatment is working for them. But also the side effects and the symptoms, they were uncertain if they were experiencing something, like how long it would take would it take for their entire lifetime? Is it associated with the treatment, with the illness? Many questions they asked to us as researchers that they were confronted with, and where they could find no information about. These elements informed them the attributes and the levels that we included in a subsequent quantitative patient preference survey. So where on the left-hand side, you see the different attributes and their explanations. So these were developed based upon the findings from the qualitative phase, and importantly, also the way we described an attribute. So for example, here, additional life expectancy in years, we explained as the expected number of years they are alive starting from the beginning of the treatment. All of these explanations were in fact developed based upon the language that patients used themselves during the group discussions, and also iteratively via pilot rounds involving patients and patients' organizations to really come up word for word with the best manner to describe an attribute to them. The levels that we associated with each of these attributes were based for some of the attributes here on the clinical evidence that we found for therapies for multiple myeloma. So where we also looked at clinical trials and the medical products being prescribed currently, and also are relying substantially on input from our hematologists involved in the case study. We also relied on what patients themselves said during the group discussions that would affect their preferences. So where they said that the duration of, for example, thinking problems, that when this would be permanent, that this would make them want to stop taking a treatment. So this was really a dimension that where their preferences would flip, as to say, or likewise with the severity of several of these attributes that they mentioned. If it starts to be severely limiting me in my daily activities, that is when I would stop taking a treatment for my myeloma. So here you can see how we explained these attributes in the survey to patients. So before completing the preference questions, we provided them with this explanation of the attributes and the levels, as I showed to you in the previous slide. And also the levels were explained prior to completing the preference questions, and where we differentiated between, for example, mild and severe, as severe being limiting their usual activities, while mild not limiting their usual activities. Again, as patients said that this would make them want to continue or not, or take on a certain treatment, yes or no. Here you see an example of a discrete choice experiment questions that we provided to patients. So where you can see that patients were confronted with two hypothetical treatments, and that those treatments differed across the attributes that we revealed in the patient preference in the qualitative phase. The results show for the discrete choice experiment that on average, life expectancy was the most important to patients, followed by mobility problems and pain. But this is, of course, on average. You see already here that the confidence intervals show that the difference between, for example, mobility problems and pain was not significantly different, versus life expectancy was obviously significantly different from mobility problems and pain. I think it's very important here to say that this is on average, because we also did several subgroup analysis based upon the patient's characteristics, and where we revealed 3 different groups of patients who had substantial or significantly different attribute values for the different attributes included, and where these 3 different groups differed according to their experience with the disease. So based upon how long they were diagnosed with multiple myeloma, they would attach more or less value to these attributes. And where we revealed that life expectancy was most important for patients included at the end of their treatment. So who had no treatments anymore in front of them, let's say. Again, life expectancy was also most important for the patients who were at the beginning of their treatment. But other attributes we included, such as pain, mobility, and thinking problems, those were in fact more important than life expectancy for a group of patients who had intermediary treatment experience. Here, what did we now learn from this study in a methodological and organizational sense? So you here see a list of learnings, and I will briefly touch upon the most important points. Is the importance of including a qualitative portion in the preference study to ensure that the attributes are selected that are sensitive and appropriate, that they are relevant to patients, and that they should be included in the next quantitative phase of a patient preference study. This to increase the internal validity of that survey since if you exclude a potential very important attribute, this limits the validity of a quantitative preference survey. We also involved clinicians to ensure that the attributes were clinically plausible and the levels, and that they were formulated also accurately. And also the involvement of preference researchers or the rules of can help ensure that the rules of attribute development are adhered to. For example, that attributes are not overlapping. In general, the importance of very well transparently describing the study design as well as all methodological choices that were made. This to enable those who are reviewing the preference study results to contextualize it and also evaluate the usefulness of a preference study in decision making. We also found that it's very important to ensure that the study design is targeted towards the patient population. So, for example, looking at whether multiple myeloma patients prefer interviews, group methodology, how to practically organize it, do it online or face-to-face. We must support the patient population when designing these studies. Also, the need to look whether ethical approval and contractual agreements is needed. As you saw in the first slide, we involved a lot of hospitals, a lot of clinicians, and we wanted to disseminate the survey, or we disseminated the survey across Europe. So this required us really to look into how to obtain ethical approval in these different countries. And also, if the involvement of patients and clinical partners takes place, this must occur by also explaining them really carefully what is a patient preference study about, so that they can be informed and give good input during all the different steps where their input is really valuable. Here we see our learnings for the quantitative preference survey design. And several of them actually are also elaborated on the qualitative part. Is really also to here involve the patients and patients' organizations in all of the different steps of the study design. This to ensure that they don't drop out during the preference study. So it's also from a quality point of view, researcher point of view, very important to involve them. And this also via extensively piloting the survey. We need to obtain also the participants' background characteristics, especially those that potentially explain preference heterogeneity, such as their treatment and disease experience. Also to investigate whether the attributes, so to investigate preference heterogeneity and whether the attributes are statistically influenced by patient backgrounds. And then the need to also be inclusive towards patients. So the need to make or try as much as possible to involve patients from with different disease and treatment experiences, so that the patient preference study results also reflect the preferences of those harder to reach patients often. And last but certainly not least is to facilitate the communication of the preference study results to a large audience via publishing them in peer-reviewed journals, but also in lay language formats, to ensure that the patient population itself can find back actually these preference study results. And now I will give the word to Irina Cleemput, who will discuss about patient preference study use in decision making. Thanks a lot.
Okay, there we are. Thank you, Rosanne, for this very nice explanation of your multiple myeloma study. What I will do now next is to look at how the results of this multiple myeloma study can actually be applied in a medical product decision making. So all the decision making processes along the medical product life cycle. But of course, because I'm a health economist and an HTA person working at the Belgian HTA agency, I will focus in particular on the application of patient preference studies and of this multiple myeloma study in particular to the health technology assessment and reimbursement decision making. I would like to stress once again that this is what I will present here today is on my own behalf, not on behalf of KCE, my institution, or on behalf of the National Health Insurance Institute, who is a decision maker in Belgium. This is really my personal viewpoint. So when we look at the medical product development life cycle, we can see different phases in which patient preference studies can inform decision making. So if we start here at the very beginning at the drug discovery and early development, we see that patient preference studies can help to identify patient needs and hence to identify areas where further development and research is really needed, and which kind of needs these new developments need to meet in the future. This identification of patient needs is not only important to inform the decision making about drug discovery and early development, but also to identify the patient relevant outcomes that need to be included in a clinical trial in the clinical development phase. This is the second phase here. And then subsequently in the regulatory benefit risk assessment, so when a pharmaceutical company, for instance, wants to obtain marketing authorization of its product, it needs to submit a dossier explaining all the benefits and the risks, which is then assessed by the regulatory agencies, like, for instance, the European Medicines Agency. And they can be informed by patient preference studies also in their assessment of the performance of the new medical product on those endpoints that matter to patients. So these are also coming from the first and the second phase here explained before. Patient preference studies can then also be helpful in identifying what are the relevant effect sizes from the patient's point of view. And this is, of course, also very important for a regulator and also for a health technology assessment body later on to know whether the medical product is actually generating benefits or effect sizes that really make a difference to patients. And that's also something that you can assess via patient preference studies. And as explained already in the example of Rosanne, we also see that patient preference studies can also highlight uncertainties that patients are willing or not willing to accept in terms of the benefits and risks of future treatments. In the health technology assessment phase, the information on unmet needs or unmet patient needs is very important in the relative effectiveness assessment of new medical treatments. Because what we will do, and I will explain that more extensively later on, is that we will look at the performance of treatments, and that's including also the standard of care on all the endpoints that matter to patients and that are considered important to patients. So we will look at the performance of these treatments on the one hand, and also the relative importance of these endpoints from the patient's perspective on the other hand. And this is what we will include in our relative effectiveness assessment, or could include. Also, uptake is something that could be informed or estimated based on patient preference studies, but more research is required on that part. And then finally, in clinical practice, patient preference studies can help in shared decision making, and not only in the face-to-face shared decision making, but it can also be the basis for the development of shared decision-making tools. What we've also identified as a potential use of patient preference studies is in the clinical practice is that healthcare professionals can use these kind of information from patient preference studies to guide the discussion they have with patients about the endpoints that are identified as being important to them. Sometimes endpoints that they wouldn't consider of major importance themselves, but patients do consider of major importance because of their lived experiences. So in what comes next, I will focus more particularly on how the multiple myeloma patient preference studies can inform the HTA decision making. But before diving into that question, I would like to note once again that the remit of HTA is to balance the societal needs and the individual patient needs in a broader context. So the objective of HTA is to advise the healthcare or the public healthcare payer about the best way to allocate its resources in the entire healthcare system. So we cannot afford as HTA bodies to focus only on the individual patient needs. We will have to put this into a larger societal context and therefore make this difficult and delicate balance between individual patient needs and societal needs. So these are 5 questions we think are really guiding the health technology assessment process, being the first one about whether the products that has been submitted for reimbursement, for instance, really targets a therapeutic and societal need. And obviously, when you consider patient preference studies, you will learn more about the therapeutic needs of patients. And this has also been very nicely illustrated by Rosanne in her case study, that you learn more about what patients really want to see improved when a new treatment would be developed or would be implemented or applied. So the patient preference study will inform you about the needs of the patient, what matters to them, what matters most. But then the next question is a more principal question. Are we as a society prepared to pay for any treatment out of public resources for this disease? And this I call a principal discussion because it really relates to, for instance, do we think that this is a treatment that patients should pay for themselves, for instance, because they have made specific lifestyle choices, risky behavior, etc. Or do we think that given the severity of the condition, for instance, that the patient should not pay for this treatment and this should be covered from public resources? So this is really a kind of principle, moral question that comes in between. The next question is then, are we as a society prepared to pay for this particular treatment, the particular treatment that has been submitted for reimbursement? The answer to this question will depend on the extent to which this new treatment meets the most important needs of the patients. And so we will go back to the first question to see what these needs are, and then we will see to what extent this treatment actually meets these most important needs of patients. And this will determine to a large extent whether the treatment is worth paying for, also worth paying for still in principle, depending on, of course, the price of the new treatment and the affordability in the healthcare context. Next question, are we prepared to pay more for this treatment than for the best alternative? This depends on, of course, on the price and on the value it offers based on the conclusion of the previous question. And how much more are we willing to pay? This will really depend on the relative level of need of this patient population, the relative effectiveness of the treatment, the ability to pay, the affordability, etc. So on many different criteria, one of which is, of course, the relative needs of this specific patient population compared to other patient populations in the healthcare system who also have needs, and maybe very high needs, which needs to be compared amongst each other. In the next few slides, I will focus on the application of patient preference studies in relative effectiveness assessment, and specifically on the results of the multiple myeloma patient preference study. So what did we learn from the multiple myeloma study? We learned, for instance, that life expectancy is a very important criterion for these patients. They want to see their life extended. So this is a very the highest important criterion for at least for a subgroup of the patients, as we've seen. but also mobility problems, pain, different sorts of pain, vision problems, and many others were considered as being of high importance to patients for in terms of what they would like to see improved when a new treatment is being applied. For the second, more principle and moral question, I would say that, of course, multiple myeloma is a very severe condition, and usually for these severe conditions, there is not such a huge discussion on whether we should pay for treatment of these patients out of public resources. This is really a question that refers more to specific mild conditions happening after specific decisions on lifestyle or chosen behavior, etc. So I think this one we can omit. And then for the next question, are we as a society prepared to pay for a particular treatment for multiple myeloma? This will heavily depend on the results of clinical studies that compared the new treatment with the existing standard of care and the impact of the new treatment on the different elements that were identified as being important for patients. So we would like to know as a HTA agency, what is the impact of the new treatment on overall life expectancy? What is the impact on mobility, on pain, vision problems, etc. So we would like to see outcomes and performance on outcomes that matter to patients. Are we prepared to pay more? Well, this depends, of course, on the clinical significance of the benefits. Are they clinically significant from the perspective of the patient, but also what is the cost per patient? And maybe what is the cost per quality? And then finally, how much more are we willing to pay? This is a difficult question. We will then have to compare the relative level of needs of multiple myeloma patients with the needs of other patient populations. We will also look at the performance of the new treatment on the different criteria that matter to patients, but also on generic criteria that we can compare across patient populations, on the budget impact and so on. So this is really more in a more visional approach. So what we will do de facto is to compare the standard of care and the performance of standard of care on all the criteria that matter to patients with the performance of the new treatment on these same criteria and these same attributes. And what can we do next? Well, there are two approaches that we could apply in HTA. And I'm not going to express myself on what I think is the best approach. I think this is really a national decision to take, but we identified in Prefer two different approaches, and that is to combine or to use the preference data in parallel with the clinical data, not combining them mathematically, so more as a complementary source of information in the deliberative assessment of the relative effectiveness of the new treatment compared to standard of care. Or alternatively, it could be envisaged to combine the preference data with clinical data in a mathematical approach. So mathematically combine preference data with clinical data, and this could actually lead to some kind of single outcome measure that could in principle be used in cost effectiveness analysis if the cost effectiveness analysis focuses only on treatments for one specific disease and does not aim at making comparisons across different diseases. Because of course, these outcomes, life expectancy, mobility, pain, and so on, these are very specific outcomes that matter to multiple myeloma patients, but might not be the same outcomes that matter most to other patient populations. So you can only use this as a single outcome measure in cost effectiveness analysis within the indication of multiple myeloma. And this is not what all agencies would aim to do. So there are agencies that say, no, we want a generic outcome measure to be able to compare different patient populations. So in summary, multiple myeloma patient preference study helps to understand what the patient needs are, and I think this is a really important value of patient preference studies. They learn us what matters to patients, what matter most, and what we should look at when we are assessing new treatments. Secondly, identification of the patient needs will then inform the choice of the clinical and non-clinical outcomes that should be included in clinical trials in order to assess or measure the performance of new treatments on these outcomes that matter most to patients. And then finally, we can use this information on the unmet needs and on the performance of a treatment on these unmet needs in the relative effectiveness assessment. I would like to highlight two remaining issues from my point of view, and that is the dealing with the heterogeneity. We have seen in Rosanne's presentation that there is heterogeneity within the population of multiple myeloma patients, heterogeneity in patient preferences. And I was thinking about this and I was wondering, what is the relevance of this for HTA and reimbursement? How can we deal with that in HTA and reimbursement? Do we really want to do something with it? Because if we do, that would mean that we would make different reimbursement decisions depending on the preferences of the patients. Do we really want to say, given your preferences, we will not reimburse you this treatment? So this is, again, a moral issue, an ethical issue we should think about. And then the relative needs of multiple myeloma patients compared to the other patients. This is related to the last question in my five question list of what HTA is considering. Here, we don't have information from the patient preference study on the relative needs of these patients compared to other patients. And as I explained before, you still can use this if you're making decisions within an indication. But whenever you want to go outside of that, if you want to make comparisons with other populations, you need generic outcomes, and you need maybe patient preference on generic outcomes as well, not only on the disease-specific outcomes that matter to patients. And with that, I would like to give the word now to Jayne, who will speak on the involvement of patients. Jayne, the word is yours.
Hi, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. So yeah, my name's Jayne Galinsky. I'm the former head of research at Myeloma Patients Europe, and I led the patient involvement aspect of this myeloma study with the Prefer team. So I'm just going to go into my first slides. So I want to talk about how important it is for patient organizations to have collaborations like this. I think that patient organizations really agree with the need for well-designed patient preference studies. Patient organizations want robust and systematic evidence to firstly understand the needs of the patients that we're working with, and also for our own submissions. And when we submit what we think, about a certain drug that's being approved. So patient organizations really want this kind of data, and it's really great for patient organizations to be involved. So really recommend working with patient organizations when designing and developing these preference studies. Scientific rigor is sometimes quite difficult to navigate for patient organizations if they don't have research teams within them. So academic or industry support on this is really crucial. Patient organizations want to know about sample size, about how to ask questions in the right way. When does a survey need to go through ethical approval committees, why, where, and how, and also support with peer review and publication. So there's lots of things that I think patient organizations really need, but conversely, we can bring to these preference studies. We bring a real kind of real world patient perspective to industry and academic studies. So collaboration for patient perspectives is really important. So what can patient experts bring to patient preference studies? I think that patient organizations and patients can add a validity and legitimacy to projects. Patients are really well placed given knowledge of the disease pathway and direct interactions. we really interpret the literature and think about what happens in the real world. And this study took place during COVID, so there was different things happening to patients that might, otherwise be in the guidelines for myeloma. So there was a very real world aspect to the work. And I think that's what patients can bring to these studies, is actually what's happening in their hospitals, what's happening with their kind of support networks, and bringing those kind of questions and perspectives to patient preference studies. Patients are able to review and comment on the information that goes out to patients. So in this study, we had lots of patients from different countries around the world, around Europe, reviewing the documentation, reviewing the information sheets, thinking about whether the language made sense, whether it was sensitive enough, whether there was this kind of, and we had a lot of discussions about medical language versus plain language terms, and what made sense for patients. Is it better to have it medically correct, or is it better to have a plain language term that more patients would understand? So there was lots of complexities, and having patients involved in those discussions to be able to comment and talk about what made most sense to those patients was really important. Myeloma Patients Europe has networks across Europe. We have member groups. So we were able to distribute the survey across different countries and get a really good sample as a result of that. And then also thinking about how to interpret the meaning of the results to patients in their countries, for patients to be able to use that data to inform their own advocacy messages, to inform their own submissions, and just using the results kind of in the real world. So I think that's really great to have that kind of true kind of application to patients with studies like this. So for this study, Myeloma Patients Europe were involved at each key phase to provide the patient perspective. So we provided input on the clinical context of the disease through lots of the discussions in the qualitative focus groups. We thought about the understandability of questions and attributes and levels, and if they made sense to patients, and if they made sense to healthcare professionals, and where the balance was, where we were going to get, where it would make most sense for patients, but also be good for the project too. We supported organizations, so we recruited to the project for both quantitative and qualitative stages. We identified clinical partners to support protocol approval and recruitment, and we briefed patients on the project. So before patients were actually filling out the surveys, we were providing information on what patient preference studies were, so that they were really kind of prepared to take those surveys and fill them out in a way that really kind of made the most sense. And then again, reviewing transcripts, conference submissions, publications, and interpretation of the results. Again, what does it mean for patients? Why is this important? Patient organizations can really help get those messages across to patients, and I think that's what we did in this study too. So just because I know we're running out of time, I'll go through this last bit quite quickly. So our conclusions and recommendations were that we just learned so much from working with researchers on this study. It was really amazing to be part of, and yeah, I think it was just a really good collaboration. Patient preference studies are quite complex and can be difficult to explain to patients. I think the hypothetical nature of some of the preference questions can be quite challenging for patients, thinking about, is this a real treatment we're being asked to comment on? And these kinds of questions. So I think patient organizations are quite well placed to be able to support patients in doing the surveys and answering any questions that they have, and making sure that we do our best to make sure patients kind of get them and that they make sense. We found that patients really preferred the discrete choice experiment questions. Patient preference questions can be quite emotive to patients. Balancing and making these trade-offs can be really challenging. So again, I think having a patient organization involved is really helpful, and just making sure that any kind of explanations are really clear for patients. Something that we did find out within the study is checking translations with native speaking patients. So we were really lucky to have patients around Europe who did this for us. for us, okay, from a patient perspective. So again, native speaking patients, checking translations was just absolutely critical for this study. And the different countries face different recruitment barriers. Some patients in some countries are not used to being asked questions like this. There's different treatments approved in different countries. So again, just being really mindful of that when doing these types of surveys, and kind of giving patients information before they take the survey so that they really know what's coming. So yeah, those are our recommendations and conclusions, and it was just it was really great for patient organisation like Myeloma Patients Europe to be part of this. So yeah, I'll finish there. Thank you. I think I'll hand over to Rosanne to take any quick questions. I know we only have a few minutes left.